Thanks everyone for coming today. Look, a very exciting, slightly different webinar that we really wanted to listen to and get into today. Managing Personal Risk in a War Zone with Geraint Bermingham. I'll do a bit of an intro, a little bit about what it's going to cover today, and then we'll get straight into it, but really great to be here. Following a 20-year career as a nuclear submarine engineer, Geraint worked as a risk engineer with a number of major consultancies in Wellington. Before joining Air New Zealand as Manager Operational Risk and later Manager Risk and Performance with the company's internal audit function. A founding member of Risk New Zealand, how's that, eh? Who served as chair for 3 full terms. Geraint was given life membership in 2018, and I know everyone still talks very highly about Geraint's time with Risk New Zealand. He is Director of Navigatus Consulting and specialises in the management of high hazard risk and has a particular focus on the maritime and aviation sectors. So today, we're going to explore lessons and perspectives of managing personal safety while recently living and working in Ukraine, and to what extent the application of formal risk management thinking helped to prepare for and manage that risk in an active war zone and under almost daily drone and missile attacks. Geraint, look, very impressive, mate, and over to you.
Thank you, David. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'll just share my screen and get into the presentation. Okay, can you confirm it's showing properly, David?
Yes, all good, Geraint. And just a quick one, we'll take questions at the end. It's set up as a bit of a meeting, so you may be able to ask or just please place them in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't mind being interrupted if people have got particularly pressing questions. Okay, so obviously a lunchtime presentation. I just have to get this thing to work. Okay, so it's a reflection on my own personal, how well or otherwise I managed my personal risk whilst working and living in Ukraine. So I went to Ukraine in June of this year, and I returned in August, or end of August. And it was quite an experience, I'm sure you can guess. But I thought it was really useful to reflect on how well or otherwise I planned for the risk and managed risk whilst there and subsequently. So I suppose scope and purpose of this talk, it's I think a useful real world test of managing personal risk under stress. It's perhaps something we don't perhaps always consider, but certainly in our workplaces, people are under stress. They come in different forms. It might not even be centered on the workplace. So I think it's something that human factors piece is really important to consider. As I said, I'll look at to what extent, how otherwise I've managed my own risk. And I'll do that by referring to the established risk management processes, as in the 31,000 standard, and also the OODA loop, more dynamic way of managing risk or framework, and to what extent and how well did I manage my risk in the day-to-day environment, a dynamic environment. So an obvious question, why take the risk? I suppose shock, really. The first was the shock of the invasion. We live in a post-Second World War environment with the United Nations, and one of the key rules is might isn't necessarily right, and you don't take other people's stuff, and particularly their land. And also just to reflect on the Ukrainian and Russian history and these fabulous statues of brothers in arms, very closely aligned for hundreds of years, not necessarily aligned, but certainly closely engaged with each other. Each culture has been for hundreds of years. So how can you possibly attack your cousin, your brother, your neighbor? Yeah, so it was a real shock, and I watched the invasion unfold on the webinar or webcams that were dotted around the country, and particularly the one in Kiev, thinking how's this going to unfold. The other shock to me was just how naive a lot of people seemed to be, how easily the Russian narrative was just soaked up and accepted as truth or as legitimate or as a genuine excuse for bombing and killing people. I just absolutely stunned. Statements like, but Putin's afraid NATO's going to attack him. Just a minute. NATO is a defensive treaty. And how are you going to get 31 countries to agree to attack another? It's like, just listen to yourselves. So I was really shocked at how simplistic, I suppose, some people's understanding of the world was. The other shock was within days to see the brutality of a Russian army that claimed to be the second greatest army in the world, most powerful, and yet they behaved atrociously, worse than atrociously. It just stunned me how quickly people could become savages effectively. And the last really thing that struck me was, if we don't have a rules-based international order, how the hell are we going to fight climate change? Our survival as a species really hinges on us having rules. And there's Russia, permanent member of Defense Council of the UN, blatantly breaking the rules. Yeah, so that was why I got interested right from the first moments of a war. So another aspect is, what was my perception of a risk before I went to Ukraine? My wife had already said to me sometime previously, or maybe you should visit. I don't think she, the war was sort of a fairly settled time at the time because of my interest. And a friend had remarked to other people at the dinner table, oh, Geraint's going to go to Ukraine. Sort of almost forced my hand a bit. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for mentioning that to people. Anyway, so my perception of risk was partly driven by my own background. I spent 20 years in the Navy, in Royal Navy, most of it, almost all of it, in the submarine service, with the self-evident hazardous environment and having to confront risk, particularly operations under the ice cap, very tense. And so I felt I had some ability to handle risk, personal risk. There's also a point that we've got to go out of this world somehow, and it's probably going to be more likely you'll get hit by the big red bus or some other day-to-day activity that takes us out. So I've ridden cycles in Wellington and the motorways near Wellington and Auckland. I used to ride a motorbike in Auckland, and I currently glide in the Southern Alps. So there's a number of other ways I'm taking risk, and life is full of risk. So there's an element of fate, I suppose. But I think the key one was, Ukraine's a very big country. And what is the probability that actually you're going to be hit by a missile, short of going to the front line itself? So a simple numbers game. What's the probability? Big cities, big country, big sky theory, as they say. Basic maths. And the other point is, my kids are grown up. Who's going to miss me, really? And you only get one go, and I'm getting older, and there'll come a point where this type of risk taking, I won't be up to it, I guess. So an element of having to get on with it, an element of low probability, and an element that it's not the only risk in life. So start of a beginning of any risk process is context. And so let's orientate ourselves on Ukraine. I'm sure most people have got a pretty good sense of Ukraine now. It's a big country, the east of Europe. very tied up historically with Poland, Romania, and of course Russia itself, and more broadly Turkey, Greece, if you go back far enough. And it was actually settled, Kiev was actually settled by the Vikings, who came down the river, up the rivers, down the rivers. Yeah, really interesting history. And there's a fabulous Yale University history series on YouTube by Professor Timothy Snyder, if anyone wants to really get a sense of a country and its history and its people. Again, you've all been watching the news. Kyiv is a capital city. Kyiv is a correct pronunciation, the Ukrainian pronunciation. We don't use the Russian pronunciations anymore. Lviv is a beautiful Eastern European city in the West and generally has been considered as a relatively safe city. Kharkiv is a true frontline city, very close to the Russian border, and it's been able to hold out, but it gets shelled quite often. Odessa, beautiful long history to Odessa, a port city in the south where most of the grain is exported from. Kherson, which is was taken by the Russians, but they withdrew across the river, and now they attack it from a distance. Zaporizhia is another name you've probably heard. Again, a frontline city, effectively, currently. Other names you see here, Crimea, of course, very important in today's story. A name you might hear is Donbass, which is really the industrial east of a country that Putin has got his eyes on and has been occupied for some time, since 2014. And also Belgorod, which is a Russian oblast or region, which often gets heard in the news because it's a frontline region. In terms of understanding the relative risk, I really would classify, we've got the temporary occupied territories, which are inaccessible at the moment. They have the red ones in this map. The annexed oblasts, which is Crimea, etc. The front line, obviously very high risk. What I've called the back line, which isn't a term that other people use, but I think there's another line which is getting a lot of hammering. There's a high risk, even though it's not a front line. There's obviously the rear, the Lvivs, and other cities like that in parts of the country. But also there's a trend, what is the change over time? Sorry, I should have put this one up first. This is quite a good map of effectively relative risk, its impact sites, number of drone attacks, etc. So quite a lot of a country is under really high risk. Other parts, obviously, quieter. And when I talked about trend, well, this was quite a useful. There's a lot of data available, mainly by Ukrainian websites and organizations, but not entirely Ukrainian. And this shows a number of attacks over time. In this case, it's shelling, but it was quite a useful indicator of what was happening. It wasn't very useful, actually, because that ran until June. I mean, July was pretty horrendous, and August was horrendous, and yeah, it's got pretty intense again. But it was indicative that the intensity of fighting and the intensity of the risk changes over time. So I suppose to start thinking about how did I mitigate risk, the first was prior research, like I've just been through, and getting some understanding of what the level of risk is in different parts of the country, how it's changing over time. And most of that information came through social media channels. There's some very good ones. Some that I stopped watching because they were too raw, I suppose. And also traditional media. If you choose good sources of information, you can stay pretty well informed. Orientation, how I orientate myself to Ukraine. I learned a bit about the history, as I've said. I also tried and continue to try to learn the language. And the script's not too bad, but some of the pronunciation takes some mastering. I also engaged with a program called Engine, which is some Ukrainians based in the United States set up a big program where you can help teach Ukrainians English. So I had 2 students for a while, which was proved very, very useful. One, she's in the special forces in Ukraine. So, and obviously did a lot of research on maps, bought a bunch of books on history, recent history in particular, and get some sense of what the cities are like. Also informed sources. There's some very good podcasts, very good YouTube channels. You get bombarded with a lot of rubbish, of course, so you have to be very picky. But Yale University history course is outstanding. Timothy Snyder, even Ukrainians are really impressed with his language skills. He speaks Ukrainian better than most Ukrainians, and he speaks Polish better than most Poles, and the Russian is pretty good as well. So he's exceptionally well qualified. New publications as books came out, I'd grab one and read it, and also try to learn something about the culture, which is a real beautiful, long history, long culture, but quite different to the Russian culture, despite what some of the channels might claim. But they've only been truly independent briefly. The black soil of Ukraine, the very fertile soils, have been sought after by many nations over time, including, of course, Hitler. Very attractive wealth in the country, natural wealth. And also news sources, including Russian news sources. Medusa is an independent Russian outlet. So that's really useful. You get to see Russians talking to Russians. Kyiv Independent, a relatively new newspaper, very good English-speaking newspaper. Telegraph have a particularly good podcast called Ukraine the Latest, with ex-military people, so but very, very expert and very good at explaining concepts and exploring concepts. And of course, Telegram channels, again, you have to be picky to get relevant ones. So that was really useful to learn something about a country I was aware of, but really didn't have a lot of knowledge of. So for risk mitigation, how proactive was I suppose? It was a bit piecemeal. The more I learned, the more I realized I needed to learn. And I've got a family connection who gave me a bit of guidance on these things. He's got certain qualifications. The key point is volunteers have been, so I was going principally to be a volunteer to assist. So volunteers have been targeted. There's rumors of, it's known as Russian agents on the streets. Clearly, anyone who puts themselves out online is potentially a target. And so I quickly established that I would need a separate identity for Ukraine. So I created an identity that was separate by passport identity, as it were. Communications, again, I was advised you need a communication plan. Okay, fine. How do I do that? So basically, a separate identity had a separate phone with separate SIM cards, separate telephone number, connected only through Ukrainian channels, cellular channels, etc. Where any of my established connections went through a VPN, including my phone, my NZ phone. So there were times I accidentally broke this rule, but it was quite useful. It was very useful to almost have two identities. My identity in Ukraine, where I go on with Ukrainian stuff, and my identity elsewhere, where I go on my normal life. In a way, it helped. It may help and make a split. Travel was quite challenging to work out how to get there. Border crossings are there's a few border crossings. Some are easy to get through than others and more consistent in their rules. Again, I used social media, trying to understand what was the best way to do it. Travel bookings were quite complex, and a lot of social media channels that talk, how do I get here? How long does it take to get through this border crossing, etc. So I came in via Poland, which seemed to be the most appropriate, safest and most reliable way in, by train. You get out of one train, you go through passport control, get on another train because the gauges are different. And I ummed and out about what passport I renewed, an old UK passport I had. But in the end, I actually traveled on my New Zealand passport. And what I learned was actually that was a wise move in terms of facilitating border crossings and getting, shall we say, asked not quite as many questions as some people have been asked. And also consider what other fallback options there were, because to be honest, I didn't expect to be able to get in first time. Other aspects, insurance, I got Ukrainian insurance cover in addition to my existing one, which luckily it doesn't have an exclusion for war. I've obviously advised my banks. I was traveling. I built a funds reserve in another account. My wife had good experience with Wise's card, so I used a Wise's card as well. And also, the first thing I did in country was set up a bank account and get some local cards, which was an interest in it because the bank staff never taken a New Zealand passport and set up an account, and then worked out how to spell my Welsh name in Ukrainian script. So it was quite amusing in a way, but also took quite a long time. Okay, so I'm in country now, and it became very real very quickly. First thing I'd done was really useful was downloaded the Air Alert app. So there's a number of apps that tell you about incoming sort of thing. But one I used called Air Alert is the official one. I downloaded it and started to listen to it whilst I was still in New Zealand. And that's when I realized, oh dear, this is real. So that's when I brought on an extra contractor to help run my business while I was away, because I realized I might be a bit more challenging than I expected. On the train so I caught the train intent to get to Kyiv from the Polish border. We got to Lviv, and train doors were opening and closing. Lovely train, by the way, beautiful train. And then all of a sudden there's an air alert in the city. You can hear the sirens going off. Doors were slammed, whistles were blowing, and the train shot off so fast. So I thought, okay, this is real. And then I got to the hotel that I'd previously booked, and the briefing on arrival was quite full. Here's how you get to the shelter. Here's another way to how you get to the shelter. If the screens are down, here's a back door to the shelter. Don't ignore the alarms and all that. So it was a very good briefing. I wouldn't say I had that briefing in every hotel I stayed in, but the first one was excellent. Really good briefing. Misperceptions. So we arrive, it's a beautiful city, absolutely beautiful city. First thing that struck me, so many construction cranes. I thought, surely they're not, got this much construction in the middle of a war. Anyway, I learned very soon that none of them, or I realized none of them were moving, and they've all been standing for nearly 4 years now. There's no one available to take them down, which is interesting to show how rapidly development was happening before the war. People going around the business, just getting on. The bombs might be falling, stop falling at 7 in the morning, 8 o'clock, the rubbish is being collected. The coffee shops are opening. The girls are out in their summer frocks. The trendy coffee shops are open. Absolutely determined to get on with life. F you, Putin, we're getting on. But also, it was interesting, the first long first night in the shelter. Don't hear much in the shelter, but when you come up in the morning and the smoke on the horizon, smell of smoke, and the alarms don't stop going very often. So yeah, the first week or so was, yeah, shall we say, aligning yourself with reality. And the first times you hear you get caught out, not in a shelter, or you sort of choose to just see what's going on, it becomes very real. And particularly one night, July the 4th, I remember very well, 550 drones targeted Kyiv where I was, and about 8 missiles. And that was a moment in life. I don't know whether you can hear that, if you can. So, welcome to. Sorry, have I stopped it? Welcome to a Ukrainian city at night. Constant noise, drones, bangs, drones arriving and dive bombing in. Yeah, so it takes a bit of getting used to. So you have to get used to it and you have to live with it. So the first thing you learn is wherever you are, try and know where the nearest shelter is. There's apps that show the shelters. I didn't find them particularly good because there's so many shelters, you get lost and think which one's which. Plus, at times, Google Earth or Google Maps wasn't always working because of the countermeasures. Plus, some Russian names have been changed to Ukrainian, and Google Maps haven't caught up. And the spelling is different. You know, the lettering's changed, and then Google then puts it in Roman lettering, so it can be a little complicated. But the best shelters are definitely the metro stations. And Kyiv happens to have the deepest metro station in the world, I understand, 102 meters deep or something. This is an escalator down. Apps, definitely have to have your apps. You live by the apps. Air alert apps, this is that one I mentioned previously, and it's showing the increase in risk and where the direction of the MiGs are coming from. This is a perfectly normal list of threats. 1 in the morning, 125, 156, 218, increased threat alert. That means of missiles are incoming. So you live by these things. There's a number of different ones, but they all achieve essentially the same thing. First aid course, I was a bit slow waking up to this, but I took a first aid course before I left and then realized that it wasn't fit for the job. And so I took a local one, and it's all about stopping the bleeding. And it's by far, any stretch of imagination, the best first aid course I've ever done. I actually came away feeling somewhat confident, but I was told off for not having done it as soon as I got in country. Be brave. Everyone has to be to live in this environment. And so I suppose in summary, once I'd sort of orientated myself, the key lessons were be ready, always be ready. It could happen at any time, the attacks. Oddly, get a man bag. I was walking around and everyone's got this every guy's got a man bag. Most of them are looking somewhat military, but also all the local guys. Why has everyone got a man bag? I quickly realized by the time you've got your 2 phones, your battery packs, your first aid kit, your passport, spare cards, and a bunch of anything else that you need for your own life, you need a man pack. So first time in my life I had one. I had to get a bigger one later on. Situational awareness, just be aware of what's going on all the time. Getting in a metro, who else is getting in a metro carriage? What's going on around you constantly? Where are you in the city? How can you get back, etc.? Where's the nearest shelter? Constantly on your mind. I got caught out one day. Alarm went off. Don't know where the nearest shelter is. I chose a underground car park for one. Stay tactically informed. Again, just being aware of what's going on in the world, broader world as well. Have a plan B, always be flexible. You might not get to where you're planning to go. Communication discipline, I was quite disciplined with use of VPNs, what channel I was on, and also work site security. Often you arrange to be at a location, but that location was secret until you were somewhere near it, and then you get text where to go. So the Russians wouldn't be learning where to target, basically. And photography, you had to be very careful. Sometimes you didn't take a photograph that could then be put on social media and someone learns where you were, sort of thing, or where the activity was. Get a real first aid training course. Build reliable contacts, people you can rely on, people who, I obviously needed some people who could speak English to help me through some complexities of life. Always have options. Right, get rest when able. Summer nights were very long, and get to bed whenever you could. So my plan to always do a park run on Sundays went by the wayside. Get to bed. Stay hydrated, because you don't know when you next be able to get reliable water source, and just generally be aware of what's going on around you. So we're in a couple of weeks. I had these mapped out. Just on sheltering, a bit like Russia, the underground stations. So there's some fabulous underground stations in Kyiv of the Soviet time. And this is what they look like in a typical quiet time of the day, or some of them. Some aren't quite as grand as this. But this is what they look like at night. Full of people who have either had to rush to a shelter, or those who have come prepared and brought their own beds and the like. Okay, getting real about personal risk. So I've been there a little while, and I thought, right, I need to reduce my costs, get out of this hotel. It was the second hotel I was in, and find somewhere more permanent. So this is a scan of a sketch I did myself. Where to live. Obviously, I needed a workspace because I was still running my Navigatus. Should it have a formal shelter or not, or a shelter nearby? What would that do? Is it near a potential target? Which is an interesting question, because frankly, most of the targets are apartment blocks and schools. Despite what more naive people may think, the Russians are targeting civilians. They'd be far more successful in the war if they didn't. They targeted military targets. What's the strike history of a particular location in the city? Different parts of the city, again, are targeted more than others. What connections? Metro connections, bus connections, etc. Facilities nearby, obviously important. Where's the nearest supermarket or the like. Security, has it got its own security arrangements? Most of the hotels do. Also, do they have generators? How prominent visually was a building? I think was important, because again, certainly in the past, the drones tended to come in at a shallow angle and hit tall buildings. It's not the case now. Would the facility be serviced? Would it be just a flat, or would it be an apartment, for example? Basically, where to live became a real focus for me for a while. And it was really a combination of risk factors and practicality. You still had to get on with life. So, yeah, I was quite considered in my decision-making in that respect. And of course, I ended up a place without a shelter, actually, but with a very strong core to the building. All the bathrooms were in the center of the building, made out of concrete. So that was my decision. Here's an example of impact strikes across the city. This is Kyiv. And after, 6 weeks or so, I reverted to not sleeping in the bathroom, but instead sleeping behind in a wall on a camp bed. If the alarms went off, here's where I ended up. As a rule, two barriers to the outside or a shelter. So again, you didn't spend a lot of time at night taking photographs, but I did sneak out a couple of times. One time having to drop my phone, scooter inside, for this constant hammering of missiles and anti-aircraft guns, which can really get to you, and an interesting skyline all around you. And occasionally, Cassandra, one of the bigger missiles would come, and you don't hear them coming. It's just almighty bang, which we took some getting used to. Well, I'm not sure you ever quite got used to that one, to be honest. Here's a scrap of one of the Shahed drones, which most of them are Shaheeds, or four-cylinder, two-stroke engine, very simply made, but very effective. And a typical night, this I think was the night of the 5th of July, where Lviv got attacked in particularly, and Kyiv got bypassed. Shaheeds are part of life there. So what do they look like? They're actually quite big, but simply made, mass produced, obviously, and it's actually the number of warheads, which I think are limiting the number that the Russians can build. They're nasty little buggers. They now dive bomb. So can I just check, can people hear that? David?
Yes, yes, I was just hearing it, then it stopped. Yep.
I've just got a message up saying audio settings. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that dive bombing Shaheeds is really, it reminds me of my parents talking about the V1 bombers, V1 bombs that Nazi Germany were finding at the UK cities. Very similar effect emotionally, I think. So what's it like? This was one of the first impact sites I visited, where you can walk around the city for hours and not know there's a war on. You could walk around for a day and really have no idea there's a war on. But it becomes very real when you see the impact sites, as well as obviously the alarms. This is a building I've helped with as we were patching up windows to try and make it livable again, despite the top floor missing. That I think that might be even the same building. Can't quite remember. But a perfectly functioning modern European city, buildings, offices, apartments, medical centers, you name it, just trashed. This upset me a bit. This was a kindy that I attended. The sand in the near ground is where the Shahed impacted. Luckily, it hit a tree on the way in. That's what we deduced, looking at the marks and the broken branches. And so it actually missed the building, but you can see it still did a lot of damage and actually created a fire on the upper floor. So inside it stank of burnt wood and the like. Another kindy that got struck, beautiful modern kindy. Any nonsense that they're not targeting the civilians, honestly. You need your head seeing to be frank. This was a sand pit near that first kindy, actually, and I dug out some of the toys and dug out some Shahed drone bits, put them together and took a photo just to show how real it is. And it was actually a Hungarian guy was really keen to get this picture. I gave it to him, or sent it to him, because he wanted to prove to his colleagues back in Hungary that yes, it's real. It is real. They are targeting schools and hospitals and kindies. This kindy that I'm referring to was nowhere near any other building. There's no chance they were targeting something else. That's a burnt copy of Alice Through the Looking Glass, illustrated copy, burnt. And of course, there's the recognition of those who've given their lives. Very impromptu they are. They're not formal yet. And there's a social debate about how do they formalise this. And young faces. Anyway, so I'll skip my last photo. But then it's a beautiful, beautiful cities, beautiful cities. Here's some photos I've taken. I took half a day off to go sightseeing because a lot of the other volunteers said, "Oh, you've got to go and see the glass bridge. You've got to go and see this, etc." Some fabulous Soviet architecture. I think it leaves. I think Ukraine would have been the centre of some of its fabulous architecture. Very green in summer, but you can see from the detailing on the roofs, snow in winter. There's stop the snow falling off. That in the near ground, a two-story building is actually a school, and it was lovely to hear the kids playing outside at times. Beautiful parks, absolute parks, and they might have been bombed the night before, but people go out into the parks, and there's publicly available pianos to play, and you see people playing them. Two young ladies dance into a musical fountain. The fountain dances to the music, and these ladies were dancing to that. And yeah, but today after a major attack, absolutely determined to get on with life. And also it's democracy, and protesting is part of what particularly young ladies do now. And this is a free Azov protest that I attended. Once you learn where it is, again, it's secret until the last minute. So having contacts is really important. These were some older ladies who were doing knitting or sewing of camouflage nets, which I helped out a little bit with. The lady in the foreground, her daughter lives in Christchurch. The other daughter lives in Crimea, so she hasn't been able to speak to her for 3 years. Her husband was a nuclear engineer at Chernobyl when it exploded. So we had a few things to talk about, share. Very pleasant. And this was a photograph I took on my very first morning of the sun coming up across the rooftops. Absolutely beautiful city. This is Kyiv, of course. Okay, I will mention one encounter. I wasn't sure whether to put this in, but I was in a metro, the doors opened, and this stunningly beautiful young lady in the carriage. I have to chat to her. So anyway, luckily she spoke English. But one thing led to another, and I learned how to get to the Azov protests. And this is basically secret each week, but every week they protest, and basically they're trying to put pressure on the government to put more pressure on the Russians to get the Azov prisoners, the original prisoners, released. This was a protest to do with a recent law reform to do with the anti-corruption bodies, and a law was brought in that brought the anti-corruption bodies under the control of the Auditor General. The public were not impressed. 10 days later, the law was changed. It's democracy at pace. I was really interested to talk to some of these young ladies before they headed off to the protests. You don't want to mix with these young ladies. They're beautiful, but they're tough, really tough. And I think this picture really sort of captures that. And the interesting the choices they have to make now. Do you stay and do you join the army, or do you stay and have babies? Is really what it comes down to, because Ukrainians' population needs boosting, but there's a war to fight. So it's about 8% of the army is female, actually, and quite a number on the front line, including my contact. Okay, workplace safety. I thought this might interest you people. This was a street that was being repaired, big hole in it. One which is how it will do for that. Thanks so much. We've got a water fight. So you drive with care. You never quite know what's going to be around the corner. This was a facility I was helping at converting it to a mental health facility for veterans. It's quite rudimentary work, but basically we had to strip all the concrete off the walls, dump it out the window, 4 floors up, and ready for the professionals to come in and rebuild. I picked up that all the weight was being put on all the floors, and I said, look, the floors were never designed to carry this weight, which is why they accepted that, and we started piling up the edges of floors. But anyway, quite physical work. Here's a young Ukrainian lady. Every week she'd turn up, every weekend, sorry, she'd turn up and chisel concrete. I got a bit of a reputation of being prepared to climb long ladders to fix things. There was a window that needed fixing quite high up in the building. And one precaution I definitely took was always wear gloves before handling any ex-ordnance of any description. So these are Shaheed pieces that I'm inspecting with my aviation interest. The other 2 guys there, one guy's American, ex-American Army, works for Boeing, took a sabbatical to help. And the other guy in the yellow is the Ukrainian guy, volunteer. Where's his man bag? This was it. Photo I just grabbed on the motorway one day. It's an ambulance going by, and on its roof is electronic countermeasures. I mean, how sad is that? Civilian ambulance, electronic countermeasures on its roof. And yeah, workplace safety, first aid again. The first aid courses were very good and essential. Okay, reflection. So what was I beginning to learn and since I've been reflecting on? I suppose the first one is human factors. I'd underestimated the mental toll. First there's fear, then there's an element of excitement, but also over time, pressure builds up. I was chatting to a Polish war crimes lawyer, and the Polish government would only allow their nationals to stay for 3 weeks at a time, and 6 weeks off, 3 weeks to control stress. The UN, I learned, have a 6-week limit. I'd gone planning to have 9 to 10 weeks. So I'd underestimated the human toll, shall we say. Just thing on when we're doing risk workshops and risk analysis, we always start with objectives. What would be objectives? Because risk is defined by objectives. And I do have to reflect on, does the West really understand the objective of resisting Russia? You know, have we forgotten history? It's happened once before where we believed an autocrat, and one lifetime later, we're going through it again. So I think objectives, yeah, I've always gone on about objectives. We have to understand our objectives. The other reflection is just the generational naivety, I think. And I've reflected a bit, and I even checked on my definitions, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. But Gen X seems to have forgotten history. Gen Y I've decided are just naive. Not meaning to tire everyone here. And the latest generation just don't seem to know what's going on in the world. Obviously, I'm being very just talk generally, but that's my sense when you talk to people about what's going on in the world and what's important. And also, of course, this post-truth phenomenon. So again, when we're doing risk workshops, I think understanding, if they're quite strategic workshops, is understanding who we've got in a room and what their general knowledge, level of general knowledge is, I think. And the other thing is just striking how people will spout opinions without any research at all. The moment you ask a question and reply and they go, oh, what's that? You realize they've done no research. So again, thinking about risk workshops, and I've noticed this both at quite a senior level in organizations and at quite a junior level. Some people will spout off an opinion and you find that actually they don't know the subject. So just, yeah, so it both at a sort of a societal level and at a professional level, I think it's you need to be mindful that obviously sometimes the loudest voice in the room may be the least qualified. Okay, so how well did I test? If I put myself against a scorecard, how well did I perform? So taking the principles of risk management, my own scorecard, integrated. No, it wasn't really. I did it as an aside to a busy work schedule. Was it structured and comprehensive? Sadly, no, I can't say I was. Customized, absolutely. Inclusive, I tried to be inclusive, but a lot of people weren't interested or didn't want to engage. That's what my preparation, I'm thinking. Dynamic, yes, I was very conscious I don't have to think fast. Best available information insofar as I could, yes. Human factors, I certainly tried to engage with Ukrainians, learned the history, learned the language, or tried to learn some language, but I neglected my own mental health. And continual improvement, yes, every day was an improvement as a learning experience, and you improved. Looking at the OODA loop, outside information, yeah, I learned about, I was up to date. I certainly observed what was going on, very well, kept my head up, as it were. Orientated myself, learned some history, learned some language, was on text channels, etc., and talking to as many people once I was there as I could. Decide, yeah, it was quite formal, my decisions, particularly on where to live in the cities, or when I traveled, which cities and where in the cities. Protected myself physically, absolutely, the best I could. Mental, though, I say I wasn't prepared for a mental load. And as I said, the Polish government have a rule, the UN has a rule, and I wasn't aware of that. Further thoughts, Ukraine is an incredibly digitized society. It really is leading the world, I think. It's a government app, it's one. Yeah, and I guess hopefully maybe we'll get as digitized ourselves. But there was a sense of going back in time when I arrived back in New Zealand. Sorry. Innovation, if you're in the military space or tech space, if you're not in Ukraine, you're not with it. You're just not up to speed. Every week, there'd be an innovation. One night I saw this light flashing up in the sky. I thought, what was that? And a week later, we learned there's high-speed interceptor drones, quadcopters. That's what I'd seen. I think Western society's greatest threat is we're not educating our newer generations on world history. I don't think we're teaching real critical thinking. And I think we need to be learning, again, from history. Let's not have to relearn lessons. And perhaps most importantly, what if Ukraine wins and Russia loses? What if Ukraine loses, Russia wins? And what if Russia does not lose? I think these are critical risk questions. If you're anywhere in the strategic risk area, what's the world going to learn by the outcome of this war? I've put a picture of a multiple nuclear warhead missile head on, just to think, well, if a nuclear-powered, nuclear-tipped weapons is what you need to win, to throw your weight around, well, we'll all get some. Ukraine's quite capable, I think, of in time developing the capability, as well as many other countries. Just a note, sadly, the brutality continues. This is a Kindy. What a surprise, but in this case, it's during the day. Just shocking. If you want to help, there's charities. United 24 is the official one. There's a local Kiwi one, Kiwi Care, run by Temby Powell, ex-mayor of Tauranga. And he's getting pretty close to his $750,000 goal. So if anyone's tempted to offer some money, that's certainly an option. And after the war was finished, there's a sign I took a photo of. Kyiv is waiting for you after the victory. I assure you, it's a beautiful city, as are all the other cities I visited. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so perhaps I'll wrap it there, actually. Thinking ahead, planning next visit. I am planning another visit, despite what my wife feels about it. The key questions for me, do I go alone or are there other people who would like to team up? And also, is there any business opportunities? And I'll leave you with the skyline of Ukraine, sorry, of Kyiv.
Thanks, Geraint. Look, Geraint, I was really fascinated with the whole presentation, and it really opened my eyes, and I learned a heck of a lot in the past hour. So thank you very much for that. It filled a lot of gaps which I didn't know about. We've got a couple of questions here, and we'll just go through them quickly if that's okay. First one from Andrew. I think you might have touched on this, just to make sure. Did you have any difficulties with the authorities at border crossings?
Okay, interesting story. On the way in, a young lady took my passport on the train. She looked at it, stamped it and said whatever and gave it back to me. Like, oh, that was easy. New Zealander, no problem, like sort of thing. But getting back into Poland, no, it was a different story. I don't think I had it any worse than perhaps others, but it was a long process. It had been a very long journey. And everything got x-rayed, but the bags, the double-decker coach got x-rayed. And, you know, question, what the hell are you doing here, basically? Where have you been? So I would say it was difficult, but of stories I heard that some people did get stopped. You have to choose your crossing point. The major crossing points are ones to use because they're probably more professionally manned. Yeah. But I would say the New Zealand passport was the one to travel on, definitely.
Thank you very much. Second question, Ben Lynch. Great discussion, very interesting. I get the impression you adapted to things as you went. In hindsight, and also preparing for other situations, could you have prepared more, or is accepting the level of uncertainty and adapting the best approach?
Yeah, good question, Ben. Thank you. I think I did the best I could, but there's only, here in New Zealand, there's only so much advice you can get. There's not too many New Zealanders have been there or travel there. If you were elsewhere, say in the UK, it'd probably be easier to find people with direct experience. I did speak to the ambassador here, but yeah, he didn't offer any particular advice, but basically, if you want to come sort of thing. You have to be flexible. I think that's the key. Flexible, accept things will go wrong, accept you might not get to where you're planning to go. Give yourself plenty of time. I gave myself 10 hours for every mode change of transport on the way out, and I was still late. Luckily, the aircraft out of the airport in Poland was late as well.
Thank you. And another question from Andrew Liu. Are people ignorant or fatigued from differentiating the misinformation from truth?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, obviously Ukrainians know truth from fact from fiction. The fatigue question, just thinking of Ukrainians. That young lady, that stunningly beautiful young lady I mentioned, she did remark that at first she could cope, but now she's frightened, which struck me as a really interesting comment because she struck me as a very strong person, you know, very capable and strong, robust person. But yeah, that was interesting. They are getting tired of it, but they're determined to get on. They have no choice, I think. With regard to the West, yeah, I was very conscious, you know, before coming home, I was thinking, I want to tell people about what's going on, but very conscious what those guards are going on. There's so much room that people have emotional capacity to worry about other parts of the world. Yeah, so I think there's people who are tired of hearing about Ukraine. There's people who are definitely still very focused because I think they recognize how important it is, and Ukraine must at least not lose, but ideally needs to win for the sake of all of us, for the sake of the global order. I said to many Ukrainians, you're fighting a war of civilization. I meant it, yeah.
Thank you very much, Geraint. Look, I'd like to say I enjoyed it, but I won't say. I would say that I learned a heck of a lot and a great deal, as I said before. Thanks for everyone for coming today. We'll have this available soon, and I just want to say another great big thank you, Geraint, for the presentation.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the opportunity.
Right, thank you, everybody.